She stepped into the ballroom like a hard truth, dust on her sleeves, palms still smelling of lemon and floor polish, chin lifted despite the silk and top hats that laughed at her. For a heartbeat, the music hiccuped. Cigars paused mid-ember. Don Mateo Santoro had called for his joke, his demonstration of dominion, and the joke arrived in the shape of a tired woman with a mop slung over her shoulder. The guests expected humiliation. Instead, they found a presence that made velvet coats feel thin, as if the room had been stripped to the bone and left shivering. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. Rosa Valente moved through the clustered laughter the way a hand moves through smoke, unrushed, precise. She had been summoned by a voice she knew as well as the creak of the staircase, Don Mateo's, low and amused, a sound that could order a city to tremble. 5 years of sweeping his corridors, emptying ashtrays, polishing the brass that bore his crest. 5 years of watching men like Mateo disassemble truth into convenient shapes for their guests. Tonight, the crest shone like a dare. Guests in their ornate masks thought they would see a spectacle. They would not laugh at her, not tonight. Mateo sat perched on his raised dais, the room arranged like one of his chessboards. Capos and consiglieri in careful formation, politicians with 2 bright ties sweating the edges, a rival heir splayed like a threat. His face was a mask in every sense, curated charm with iron underneath. He raised his glass as if to bless the joke, and the room obligingly laughed. Then the laughter stopped, the wine cooling in throats, when Rosa unfolded her hand and let the locket lie on her palm. The locket was small, a cheap brass thing that had belonged to her mother. Inside, folded to the size of a fingernail, was a scrap of paper whose name was a match to everything Don Mateo had spent a lifetime igniting. Mateo's smile tightened until it snapped. The joke had been his to control. And still, there is always the thing you didn't factor: a witness. A witness can become an accusation if they choose to stop being afraid. Rosa's sleeves were stained, yes, but not with ignorance. Her eyes were the gray of cities that never sleep. She had learned to hold a room's history in the hollows of her gaze. "You called, Don Mateo," she said, voice steady enough that it forced silence like a hand on a table. "I came." The guests leaned forward as if drawn by a sound that might reveal a scandal worth more than tonight's bottles. Mateo watched her like a man watching a storm decide whether to break on a town or pass it by. For all his absolute control, he had a private map of vulnerabilities, an old betrayal that taught him iron rules, a loneliness dressed in suits. Humiliation was easy for him, intimacy was not. So he turned his cruelty into teasing, the safe cruelty of men who have never been surprised by consequence. "Rosa," he said, the syllable smooth as a glass sliding over a marble rim. "You should be home by now, sweeping other people's sins off the floors. This is no place for—" He let the insult rest like a thrown coin. Rosa did not accept scorn like most did. She had learned the economy of survival. When a voice from above called, you answered, not because you had no choice, but because sometimes answering is how you bargain. Her bargain had nothing to do with Rosa's. It started with a name hidden on a scrap and ended with a ledger of debts stacked like a tower ready to fall. She had learned in the quiet hours, under the steady light of an oil lamp, how to fold words into legal seams, to trace ownership, to read the way the law met crooked men and pretended to have teeth. Those skills had been stitched between shifts and grief, the private curriculum of someone who had watched their brother die and learned not to trust the men who dictated who lived and who vanished. A capo laughed, too loudly, too eager, and the laugh was the crack in the brittle piece. Lorenzo Bianchi, ambitious to the point of cruelty, had eyes that moved like knives. He noticed the locket's edge, the way Rosa's fingers flexed around it, and recognition leapt across his features like a live wire. 2 years ago, a ledger had disappeared from a safe where only those of true trust could place their signatures. Names had been erased with a kind of patience that was almost reverent. Matteo claimed his rise was destiny. Others whispered that it was carefully carved with knives and favors. The scrap in Rosa's hand was the kind of thing that could turn whispers into warrants. Detective Sergio Marone lingered near the doorway, the city's thin law hidden under a coat of favors and debts. He had been an ally in ways the public never saw, a man who'd accepted Matteo's small mercies and processed them as necessity. His face went tight when he saw the scrap. For one sliver of a second, the night's entertainment became dangerous, real. His hands, the hands that had once cuffed a suspect for show, clenched in his pockets. He had a list of assurances Matteo kept close, and a list of sins Matteo thought were forgotten. Exposure could topple not just the boss, but the entire lattice that paid his pension and fed his family. You could have felt the temperature drop, not from the chandeliers or the night air, but from something older. The sudden, sacred quiet when the game is no longer a game. Matteo's voice, when he used it, never wasted space. "You carry what?" he asked, each word an invitation and a gavel. Rosa's fingers did not tremble. "A name," she said, "a name that belongs to the night 11 years ago." She felt the room angle toward her like a blade finding a seam. She had rehearsed what to say and what not to say, because survival had taught her that speaking measuredly was a form of armor. "I was there. I saw him fall." Someone tied the story of Matteo's rise to a certain convenience. Names were altered. I have what the law claims is lost. The room filled with the little sounds of men recalibrating. For Matteo, that single breath she had taken was a problem he had not anticipated. His empire's narrative was a carved face. He had grown from nothing. He had fought for his place. He had taken the city with a brave, brutal hand. To concede that the foundation was built on the blood of someone wronged would unmake the legend he fed to his people. Yet there was something else roiling beneath his anger. Interest, sharp and curious. He had not thought of that night in years, not in truth. He preferred ghosts that were blameless. This one, however, bore a name like a key. "You were there." Matteo tasted the words as if they might reveal whether this was confession or poison. "Why now, Rosa? Why bring this to me?" Her answer was a ledger in miniature. Hope minimal, fear exact. "Because I am tired of pretending the past can't be opened. Because I learned what to make of names and where signatures lie. Because they haunt me, Don Matteo, and because I have nothing left to lose but the silence." Someone muttered, a silk hand over a mouth, the rustle of a paper fan. But Lorenzo had already slipped from his seat. His heels scuffed the marble, anger masking curiosity. "Show it," he said. His voice was hungry, less for the truth than for the power to use it. If this scrap could be weaponized, it would buy him leverage against Matteo, a chance to move from hungry to something like secure. Rosa's eyes met Matteo's. It was a look neither of them had practiced. He saw the quiet fire, the hard-edged dignity of a woman who had been ground by life yet refused to be powdered for display. She held the locket to her chest, as if the tiny brass could still hold warmth. "If you want it to remain a joke," she said, and there was steel curled like a seam in her voice, "laugh. But if you think me a thing to be caged, know this: I do not come to be mocked. I come to be seen." Mateo's response was a small, almost involuntary smile. He liked people who declared their edges. He liked people who could endure. This attraction, annoying, inconvenient, was the kind that unsettled his rules. He had not intended to be unsettled tonight. He had intended to demonstrate. Instead, someone had brought a mirror. The mirror held not only the past, but the possibility that the past was not entirely his to own. The dilemma landed like a brick in the center of the room. If Mateo demanded the paper and destroyed it, he would continue his legend, but he would also assure blood at his door from those who knew the ledger's truth. If he allowed the scrap to be seen by the city's paper pushers or Detective Morone's notebooks, he risked losing the foundation on which every favor, every bribe, every life debt in the room rested. And then there was Rosa, small and resolute, asking for more than pity, for safety, and perhaps for reparation. Protecting her meant opening himself to ridicule or to weakness. Around them, alliances shifted. A rival family watched like wolves scenting an exposed limb. Mateo's lieutenants recalculated, the kingpins under the chandeliers measuring the value of a scrap versus the cost of blood. The masquerade had been designed as theater. Now it had become the first scene of a trial none of them had bargained for. Mateo's hand hovered near the locket without touching it. His jaw moved as if considering an equation he had not yet learned to solve. Honor and empire, pride and vulnerability. The guests expected a spectacle. The room waited, held the way a chest holds breath before a shout. Rosa's choice was simple to her and monstrous to everyone else. She could hand over the scrap and be rewarded with safety of a sort that came with silence, or she could refuse and set the city's underbelly ablaze. Her hand, small and scarred, tightened on the locket. She had kept it long because keeping it was the only way she had left to keep the face of the man who had fallen that night alive. Giving it up felt like selling his memory for comfort, an idea she could not bear. Mateo watched that hand with a look that was not pity. He understood the calculus of power. He understood the price of an empire upheld on stories. He had built his with both brutality and a kind of romance for the myth of himself. Tonight, between the laughter and the chandeliers, a maze opened. To protect his tale or to acknowledge a wound long hidden. The decision would be his. The consequences would be theirs. The music resumed, but it sounded thin now, like a violin playing under storm clouds. Mateo straightened, the room's attention an appetite he had learned to appease. "Rosa," he said, and the name in his mouth was both a summons and a test. "You have made my evening less empty. Tell me exactly what you want. Speak in terms I can understand." She looked at him then, and in that look was the memory of a family that had graves without markers, and a brother whose laughter had been stolen. Her voice did not falter. "Justice," she said. "Safety. A reckoning, small as it may be. And if you would rather I sell the paper to the highest bidder, then sell it to me. But do not laugh. Not this time." Mateo's eyes hardened for a fraction. The man who wore power liked to think he could buy hearts, silence bones, and redirect storms. Now a choice lay between him and a maid with a locket. It was a small choice with catastrophic potential, and as his guests leaned in a little closer, the night promised that the joke Don Mateo had intended would turn into the most dangerous thing a man like him could imagine, an honest question. The room held its breath like a body in the moment before someone confesses. Mateo's smile was a blade wrapped in velvet. He could have sliced the night into obedience with the lift of a finger. Instead, he folded the fold of his jaw and nodded, as if granting Rosa the dignity of having asked. "Justice is a heavy word," he said softly, addressing a dozen masks but looking only at her. "People use it when they mean revenge, and revenge is messy. Tell me what you think justice looks like." She wanted to tell him about graves dug without names, about a brother's shoes left by the river like a mute protest, about a mother who learned to speak in the shallow grammar of hunger. She wanted to tell him the kind of things that could break a man into confessing or kill him quietly. But there were listeners in the room who wore loyalty like armor and knives in their boots. Rosa unwrapped a different truth, a smaller, more dangerous one. "A statement," she said, "a record where the name is written, a public place where those who assert things must answer for them, and money to bury my mother properly, if it will keep me from being a bargaining chip." Mateo considered her as if measuring timber for a bridge. He could see the utility of satisfying a woman who, by rights, had nothing to bargain with. It gave him the appearance of magnanimity without cost, unless that scrap was used as a match. Lorenzo's mouth twitched. The hunger in him tasted betrayal. Detective Sergio's eyes flicked like a man watching a fire plan its expansion. The rival heir, a young man named Emilio De Luca, smiled the small smile of a predator weighing whether to leap. Outside the gilded walls, treaties made in smoke and ink waited to be renegotiated. "Give me the paper," Lorenzo said, before Mateo could decide, his voice the polite scolding of a man who thought himself indispensable. "Sell it to us. We'll do our part to, what's the word? Settle. Maternal funerals are cheap." Laughter rippled like a knife edge, not all of it kindly. Rosa's face did not change but for a flash of cold hate. "You think money will make my brother return?" she said. "You think you can buy silence and call it peace? I want the name known. I want it in places where men like you can't smudge it with your pens or your promises." The bravado of the room crested and rolled back into watchfulness. Mateo's brow knit. He did not often negotiate on principle in public. His currency was favors, not ideas. But he was a man who read the wind like scripture. He also understood a different currency Rosa had, one he had not expected: courage, the unbiddable kind. The more he watched her, the more certain he felt that he had encountered someone who could neither be owned nor easily used. It irritated and intrigued him in equal measure. "Why now?" Mateo pressed. Not because he did not know the mechanics of timing. He had engineered more than one political season. But because he wanted to see the logic, the mortar binding her nerve. Why wait 11 years to bring a scrap that could pull foundations? She let the room answer in the clink of glasses and the shuffle of a shoe. "Because for 10 years I was frightened," Rosa said. "For 1 year I learned the law. For 1 night I decided the city deserved to know what it owes me and what I owe myself." Her eyes found Sergio's for a moment. An acknowledgement, not a plea. "If you want something to keep me quiet, Don Mateo, offer what you know you can give. If you want to handle things another way, handle them. But I won't let it be a punchline." Mateo's hand came up then, a slow, deliberate motion that stopped Lorenzo from stepping forward. "Enough," he said. His authority carried the same hush as thunder. He rose from his dais. Up close, his features were all polish and shadow. He looked less like a man than a monument. The crowd moved to make a ring, obligingly expectant. "I will see your scrap," he told Rosa. "We will not auction this like a curiosity. Bring it to my office tomorrow. We will speak, just the two of us. Do not be rash. Do not hand it to any journalist, any man with more greed than sense." Rosa's mouth formed the shape of a question. "And if you refuse?" The question hung like thrown rain. Mateo's eyes, dark as a closed room, flashed with something that was not purely computation. "Then you will find the city is not as forgiving as tonight's music," he said. There was a threat in the promise, and with it a strange invitation. "And you will have chosen a path from which there is no turning back." She could have walked away then and kept the scrap in the safety of silence. She could have let her brother's name rot where she could keep him unspoken and safe inside the small brass of memory. Instead, she nodded. "Tomorrow," she said. "In the morning." That night, the masquerade fractured into whispers. Some of Mateo's men argued in corners like stray dogs over a bone. A rival family sent a curt message by way of an envoy, the kind of note that read as subtle violence: "Keep hands within the house and do not try to unseat what has been built." Lorenzo, furious at Mateo's caution, moved like a caged animal, plotting how to wrest that scrap out of the gentle direction of his boss. Detective Sergio lingered beside an unlit sconce, his mind racing with calculations that served both justice and survival. Rosa left the ball not in triumph but in vertigo. The house's servants had never treated her like she was more than a shadow to be moved. Tonight, half of them watched her with the uncertain reverence reserved for people who, by accident or courage, split a night's script. She walked the corridor alone, the brass crest reflecting a face she barely recognized, a woman who had stepped into danger for a name. Her palms sweated against the locket. She had rehearsed for this moment in the hollow of laundromat basements and the hush between clock chimes. Yet up close, Mateo was an apparition who had the power of a storm. She slept badly, the scraps of her life colliding in dreams. Her mother's hand, the river's edge, the flash of a boot, the sound of Mateo's laugh, as if from another man's theater. Morning came with a chill. Mateo's office was on the uppermost floor, a narrow room with a window that looked over the harbor, where ships took contraband like felled birds and sold them in silent auctions. He stood when she entered, as if greeting someone he had both invited and not invited. The furniture smelled of leather and tobacco. A portrait of his father glowered down like a judge. When the door shut, they were alone with their debts. He did not offer her a chair, just a softer look. Up close, he was not the mask of the ballroom, but a man with a map of scars. "Speak plainly," he told her. "No audiences today." There was a ferocity in his request that calmed her. Being heard plainly by him felt like the cleaving of a knot. She unfastened the locket and removed the scrap with fingers that trembled only at the edges. The paper was small, edges browned like burnt bread. The letters were slanted and neat, a hand that took pride in form. Mateo's mouth hardened when he saw the name. It was one he had not heard aloud in years, one that had shuffled like a ghost through his memories. The air in the room shifted. The harbor sounded distant and irrelevant. "Where did you get this?" Mateo asked. The question was more a probe than curiosity. He had men who did not require papers to make them obey, but he had also built an empire that wrote checks for silence. The scrap in Rosa's hand was a piece of history he had not expected someone to carry like contraband. "Who told you to keep it? Who else knows?" "No one," she said. "It was mine the night it fell from a pocket. I kept it because it was the only thing left of him. I learned how to find evidence. I learned the alignments of signatures. I listened. I waited. Why not go to law sooner?" Mateo's tone carried something like genuine puzzlement. "You said you learned the law." "Because the law is a thing that eats people like me when they come with nothing but hunger," she replied. "You have teachers, you have men who will take your story and use it to ladder themselves up. I wanted to be sure. I wanted a way to make it matter when I asked for it to matter." Mateo looked at her with the kind of scrutiny that dissects motives. "And you chose me because?" Because men who built things sometimes keep old favors, Rosa said. Because sometimes rulers remember the faces of those who gave their first years to sweeping floors. Because you called me, and because I wanted a chance to make you choose. His silence was a kind of verdict. He paced once, twice, fingers steepled. The room seemed to contract and expand with his breathing. You are dangerous in a way I don't like, he said finally. You carry something that could either be weaponized against me or burn the hands of those who touch it. And you, she said, voice low, are dangerous in a way I know. You were a child when you learned what to do to survive. You learned to make yourself a fortress, and fortresses sometimes have to choose whether to shelter or annihilate. It was not the exchange of enemies so much as two people queasy with the possibility of alliance. Mateo's face flickered, annoyance, calculation, something like the spark of affection he had tried not to cultivate. If we do this, he said, we will do it in private. You will give me time to test the paper's veracity. If it's what you say, we will use it to settle scores in a way that doesn't topple the house. Settle scores how? Rosa asked, because she needed specifics. Words like settle had the texture of dangerous cotton, soft to the touch, heavy in weight. You make offers, but what do they mean in practice? Mateo paused, and in that pause she glimpsed the man who had built his myth not only on force, but on bargained mercy. We will find those who forged names, he said. We will find the men who made your brother vanish. We'll force confessions. We'll make some people answer in ways they fear. You will be protected. And if you prove false, if this is a forgery, then you will face whatever consequence I decide. It was not forgiveness. It was not unconditional help. It was a contract stitched from mutual fear. The terms were sharp as barbed wire. Protection wrapped in leverage, mercy braided with threat. Rosa's chest tightened. She had not expected benevolence. She had expected, perhaps, a bargain. Will you keep your hands clean? She asked. Mateo's laugh was a brief, bitter thing. No man with hands like mine has ever kept them clean. But I can keep them useful. I can decide which hands get cut off and which get bandaged. The offer, imperfect as it was an offering of proximity. Rosa had wanted to be seen. Mateo offered to see her through the lens of his own calculations. She had wanted the city's ledger cleared. Now she might have the chance to make men account for what they had done. But every choice was a step into entanglement. Aligning with Mateo meant stepping under a flag that had hidden many sins. If she accepted, she would use the machinery of the man who'd been complicit in the city's rot. If she refused, she would cast herself into a war she might not survive. She held the scrap in her palm like a coin with two faces. The room's shadows leaned in as if to listen. Rosa had spent a life learning how to press wounds into the shapes of bargains. Now, she would have to decide whether she would allow her pain to be an instrument in another man's game or to stand alone and possibly burn. I accept, she said at last, and the word stood like a pact. It was not triumphant, it was not naive. It was a strategy born of grief and of someone who had learned how to turn silence into leverage. Mateo's eyes narrowed in a way that could have been approval. Good, he said. Tomorrow we begin. But remember, this path will stain you. You will see things you cannot unknow. You will be a symbol, and symbols bleed. His voice, for the first time, carried something almost like regret. If you wish to leave before that stain dries, tell me, and I'll give you a passport out. One of the few things men like me can make disappear. Rosa looked at the window where the harbor shivered, at a world that had been indifferent and bloody. She thought of her brother, of his laugh echoing in alleys, of the river's patient swallowing. I don't want to leave, she said simply. I want a place where his name can be read, not a passport to run. Her resolve was the sort that cost less than surrender and more than comfort. Mateo's face softened, a dangerous thing in a dangerous man. "Then we begin," he said. "We find the ledger, we find the liars, and we decide which stories get kept and which get burned." Outside, the city thrummed like a great animal, ignorant of the small pivot happening in a narrow office. Inside, the two of them had aligned under an uneasy truce, a maid with only a scrap and a boss with every wrong to defend. It was the start of a dance whose steps promised danger, and, if fortune smiled a little, a kind of dangerous tenderness. They both knew the rules of that dance. Stay close enough to control, far enough not to be consumed. They also both knew rules change when the music becomes a battle hymn. Somewhere in the city, a rival family's envoy sharpened his teeth. Elsewhere, Lorenzo planned his betrayal. The tightness of the world around them tightened more. Rosa left Mateo's office with a sense that she'd set a stage she could not walk away from. The locket was back at her throat, warmer than metal should be, as if holding the memory of a life. She understood the cost of the bargain. She also understood how few options a woman with a name in her pocket had. Tonight she would sleep with her brother's name folded near the skin of her heart. Tomorrow she would step into a world where allies were made of people who had both murdered and protected. The linger of perfume from the ballroom followed her like an invisible escort. The city's night was a coat she would now wear differently, no longer only as a servant but as a claimant in a story that could topple thrones. They came at dawn, not with trumpets, but with a silence that had learned to carry pistols. Word traveled faster than daylight. A scrap of paper, a name, and the maid who had dared to hold it. Mateo's house, that cathedral of favors, filled its seams with men who smelled like danger and fresh conspiracies. Some brought bouquets of promises, some brought knives for barter. The masquerade's glitter had not yet lost its aftertaste when the first fracture happened. Not with a shout, but with the soft, certain sound of a ledger being opened. Rosa had expected maneuvers. She had not expected tenderness and then treachery so close together that they felt like the same wound. In the morning's thin light, Mateo had offered alliance as a man might offer a glove, an object to be used. He had not promised oblivion to the past. He promised control. That control began with tests. Detective Sergio Marone arrived like a man with a conscience dressed down by necessity. He spoke to Mateo behind a painted door, using the cadence of a man trying to be helpful without bleeding his employer dry. In the shadows of the office, Sergio's face was a ledger of compromise, lines around the mouth, eyes that had learned how to lie honorably. He told Mateo things that the boss wanted to hear, the names of small men who might have had access to the ledger, the ways governmental ink could be made to vanish. Mateo listened as if he were learning the fine points of a map he'd already memorized. "What concerns me," Sergio said finally, "is not only who wrote the name. It's who wanted it erased. Whoever ordered the erasure had power then. Maybe they still have it. You have to be careful." Mateo's hands steepled, always the hands of the man who balances ruin and mercy on a fingertip. "I know," he said. "We proceed quietly." "Quietly," Sergio echoed, but there was a tremor in it. He gave Rosa a look when he passed her chair, a look that could have been sympathy or the measurement of someone who calculates collateral. Rosa took it as both. The first fracture came later that day, small as an ember. Lorenzo Bianchi slipped into Mateo's study with a boldness that made his suit look like armor. He had not been invited, but he had the habit of assuming he was essential. "Don Mateo," he said, all smiles and two bright teeth. "We can't let this mar the year's balance sheets. If the paper goes public, we all burn. Why not give it to me? I can fence it. I can buy silence. You know I can be discreet." Mateo's jaw tightened. He had, for a long time, let men like Lorenzo imagine they had power. Tonight he felt the old itch, the hunger to show who actually ruled. "This is not a thing to be fenced," he said, and his voice was a warning. "If you want a scrap, you will ask me." Lorenzo's smile thinned into calculation. "I ask, my friend. Think of it as insurance for the house." "House," Matteo echoed. "You speak of my house as if it were a ledger you could mark up and sign. Rosa brought the scrap to me. It stays with me." Lorenzo's temper, already frayed by envy, snapped. "You give her safety, and you keep the power. Don't pretend this is benevolence. You control what people believe. You can bury it and keep your myth intact. Or you play at being noble and let fools like us be ruined." They argued until voices were low and knives became metaphors. Lorenzo left with bad blood and a mind that tasted mutiny. What Matteo did not see, because he never expected his own men to betray him in ways small and fatal, was Lorenzo's plan taking shape like a shadow. He would not ask politely when he could take. That evening, while Matteo reviewed ledgers that were not always financial, Rosa found a note slipped under her broom closet door, a scrap of paper in a hand she did not know. It read simply, "Meet the docks at midnight." No signature. The ink smelled of fear and opportunity. Her first instinct was to tell Matteo. Her second was a memory of being used as a bargaining chip and shoved back into the dark. She tucked the note into the locket beside her brother's name and continued with her tasks. She had learned to measure threats by whether they came with witnesses. This one came with none. Midnight at the docks was a different city. The water lapped like secrets being pulled in slow hands, and the moon made the harbor look like a wound stitched with silver. Rosa walked with the careful steps of someone carrying a match near dry tinder. She was not naive. She had been preparing for this for a year. She had practiced answering questions, had memorized the names of men who kept their sins tidy in safe boxes. But even the best rehearsed heart jumps at first blood. There were two men waiting at the wharf. One was small and wiry. The other wore the look of someone who had made power his religion, Lorenzo. The small man hemmed them in from behind. Lorenzo's grin was the smile of a snake that has learned how to charm. "Thought you'd like a second buyer," Lorenzo said, voice smooth as oiled chain. "Someone who'd pay in more than promises." "You think I am for sale," Rosa said. She moved her hand reflexively to the locket. The men could smell the stubbornness that lived in her like a second skin. It attracted danger. "Not for sale," Lorenzo said. "For leverage. Think about it, Rosa. Give me the scrap and I'll secure your life. Sell it and we'll make sure no one bothers you again. You're small in a big world. This is an offer." "And if I don't?" she asked. Lorenzo's face hardened. "Then you make enemies, and enemies make offers you are not equipped to refuse." He gestured. The small man stepped forward, a blade catching the moon. Rosa's breath tightened into a thin thing. This was the moment she had feared. The city offering cruelty in exchange for compliance. She had thought perhaps Matteo would be the greater danger. She had not expected his men to move independently. She did, however, know something else: how to bargain with the edges of things. "You think threats scare me?" she said. "You think nothing scares me." It was not bravado so much as a truth she wished were pure. "But you will find that threats are only as good as the hand that wields them." Lorenzo laughed then, loud and cruel. He lunged to seize the locket. Rosa twisted away. The blade nicked her arm, a thin line of red blooming like a confession. The small man moved to pin her, but a shout split the night, and a shadow fell across the gangplank. It was Matteo. He arrived not alone, but with two of his men. Calculated, efficient appearances that made intimidation look like choreography. He moved faster than the harbor fog could claim him, and in his wake he had a presence that snapped the conversation into military order. Lorenzo's smile faltered. He had not expected the boss to be both so close and so decisive. "Hands off," Matteo said. His voice was cold, a winter that made men shrink. He stood between Lorenzo and Rosa like a living wall. "You forget yourself, Lorenzo." Lorenzo's pride was wounded, not his fear.
"You think you're the only one who can decide things, Don Matteo?" he spat. "You can't keep everything you can't control close to your chest." Matteo's response was quick and brutal in a way that left no room for rhetoric. He signaled. His men took Lorenzo in a grip practiced over years. The small man at Lorenzo's side tried to run. Matteo's men cuffed him. The harbor's scuds swallowed their curses. Rosa's arm hurt, but it was the other pain she felt first, the sudden shift in the atmosphere between her and Matteo. He had protected her from Lorenzo's blade, yes, but there was a look in his eye that was almost possession. He was not simply defending her, he was reclaiming what he considered his property, a scrap, a reputation, an asset in the ledger of his life. His hand stroked the air as if counting debts. The protection left a residue, and she did not like what it smelled of. "Get them back to the house," Matteo ordered. His men obeyed, and the harbor's threat diminished into the soft sound of retreating boots. He turned to Rosa. "You should not have come alone." "I didn't know I would be met with thugs," Rosa said. "You thought I'd let you be used by others before I decide what to do with you," Matteo finished. He said it not kindly, but with an ugly calm. "You're naive in ways I don't tolerate." It was not the rebuke itself that fractured Rosa. It was the way his hand did not reach for the locket in her throat, but instead came to rest at the small of her back, possessive, as if she were another type of thing to be arranged. She had not come to be claimed in the way a capo claims a district. She had come to be seen as a holder of truth. Matteo's protection tasted suddenly like a gilded cage. She stepped away. "I don't belong to you," she said, and the words were both plea and wound. The harbor's wind took them and scattered them somewhere none of the men could follow. Matteo's face closed up. Still, he offered no apology. "No," he admitted, "you do not. But you are under my roof, under my protection. That has consequences." Consequences. The word landed like the snap of a trap. Rosa had bargained for justice. She had not bargained for the terms of possession Matteo seemed to assume came with his offers. The two of them stood at a thin line. Inside, the house's protection. Outside, a city that could swallow a woman for the price of a rumor. Matteo's men hauled Lorenzo's allies back to the mansion. His victory was tidy and total. But it came at the cost of a misunderstanding that widened into a rift. In the days that followed, alliances split like old wood under pressure. Lorenzo seethed in his cell with every right to mutiny. He learned that Matteo had not only arrested his men, but had also offered a deal to the rival De Luca family. Quiet compensation and the promise that the scrap would be examined in a way that would not scatter the house in public. Matteo explained it as preservation. Lorenzo read it as betrayal and began to weave his own web. He whispered that Matteo preferred order to truth, that he would keep his crown rather than expose his father's name. And those hungry for power listened. Detective Sergio, meanwhile, went between the law and his own conscience like a man who walked a tightrope over madness. He had taken bribes in the past, had kept files hidden for Matteo's convenience. But the name on the scrap reopened something in him. An old favor owed,
a wound not yet healed. He began to ask questions in halls where questions were bullets. He met with journalists in cafes that smelled of burnt coffee and danger, and he leaked small truths. Minor forgeries, a ledger here, a favor there. He told himself it was for the city's good. To others, it looked like betrayal. Rosa watched the maneuvers from a distance that made her both spectator and a target. She met Matteo each morning as planned, and each meeting was a study in how tenderness and command can strangle each other. He offered protection, resources, a promise to investigate. He also offered grudging possessiveness, as if her courage were his to catalog. He moved against threats with a surgeon's hand, but he moved in ways that made her feel like she was being cataloged in an archive called The Useful. And then, because secrets do not like being kept in neat boxes, Luca returned to the scene. Luca had been Matteo's right hand once, a childhood friend who rose with him, who knew how to make mercies necessary and murders efficient. He had not been present at the docks, but he had been present the night Rosa's brother died, his name whispered by those who held grudges. Rosa had always suspected him. She had never had proof. On a rain-heavy afternoon, she caught him in the servants' corridor, a place where he did not belong. He looked older, his face thinner, guilt scrawled like a map. When their eyes met, the air between them shuddered with accusation. "You had his name," she said before she could think. The words were an accusation that settled like dust. "Did you know?" Luca's face concreted. "I knew of the ledger," he said. He kept his voice low, as if speaking in the rooms of the dead required reverence. "I knew who had access. I did not—" "You didn't what?" she demanded. "Did not kill him? Did not erase the name? Or did not tell the truth?" He flinched as if struck. "It is not simple," he said. "Matteo asked men to make the path easier that night. We thought we were protecting the family. We thought we were preventing chaos. We made decisions we tell ourselves were necessary. I never wanted." "You never wanted my brother's life," Rosa said. "No one wanted. They only wanted to make their power clean." Luca's hands shook. "I helped. I signed. I thought it would end. I thought the ledger would be buried in the interests of greater order. I did not think it would haunt us like this." The confession was small, barely a whisper, but to Rosa it was a demolition. She felt as if the floor beneath her had been pried up and her brother's bones were exposed. Luca, the man Matteo trusted most, had been an architect in the erasure. Matteo had known his men did what men do. They protect, they kill, they make myths. The revelation was not merely that men had conspired, it was that Matteo's world was built with hands that had steered the knife. Rosa's faith, fragile as it had been, cratered. She had aligned herself with a man promising protection. The protection felt now like a blanket thrown over a crime scene. If Matteo knew and had done nothing, then the promise of justice would be performative. If he had ordered it, if he had been the architect, then the scrap was not an instrument to be used but a weapon that had to be removed. Her head swam with betrayal stacked like dominoes. The house she had stepped into, hoping for redress, was a place that had harbored murder and called it governance. Matteo's offer of help began to look like a trap that preserved the very myth that robbed her family. She confronted him that night, in a corridor lined with servants' portraits and the scent of lemon and old tobacco. "Your man told me," she said, the words a stone thrown through glass. "He told me you knew. He told me you helped bury the name." Matteo's expression changed, not into denial, but into an old, private sorrow. "I didn't order his death," he said, "but I did what men do when they believe a choice must be made. We thought the city would be safer. We thought—" His voice faltered. For a man who had grown shield and blade into persona, his faltering was a small and ruinous thing. "We were wrong." That admission did not soothe. It cracked the fragile, conditional trust Rosa had given him. Her eyes burned with something like grief and betrayal. "You used me," she said. "You sheltered me only to keep the story in your favor." "Why should I trust a man whose hands are stained with my brother's blood?" Matteo closed his eyes briefly, the way a man closes a wound to see if it still aches. "Because I would lose everything if the truth came out," he said. "Because I cannot promise you roses and true justice. I can promise you my reach, and I can promise I will try to make the men who ordered this pay in ways they cannot hope to survive." "That's not the same," she whispered. "You offer me a cleaner stain." Their confrontation split them like a fault line. Love, if that word could be used yet, was not the thing that broke. It was the brittle hope that a man who'd been groomed to command could also be trusted with absolution. Rosa left him then, not running, but stepping away, as if out of a dream that had soured. The house felt different in the wake of the argument, less like a refuge and more like a place that had learned to accommodate sins. Outside, the city's night swallowed secrets with greedy appetite. Lorenzo plotted, Sergio kept his calculations, Luca retreated into a remorse that looked like pale penance. Matteo stood alone in his office, looking at the scrap on his desk as if it were less a piece of paper and more a verdict. He had protected Rosa from a knife and then shown her he could allow knives to be used for his purposes. He had not yet realized that protecting an empire sometimes means you must be willing to lose what you love. Rosa's fracture was quieter. She went back to sweeping the corridors, to the ritual of polishing the brass that bore the Santoro crest. Each stroke felt like clearing smoke from a mirror. She had aligned with a man who could both help and harm. She had learned that alliances with powerful men are rarely purely salvific. The price of movement in Matteo's orbit was not only loyalty, but an acceptance of compromise. The city, murmuring like a beast with a new wound, rearranged itself around the knowledge that the ledger existed. Men sharpened wills and knives. The house prepared for siege in ways both literal and social. And somewhere between the harbor and the stairwell, between the locket at Rosa's throat and the desk where Matteo kept the scrap, a new kind of war was forming, not just for truth, but for the right to tell it. The fractures widened, not only in alliances, but in hearts. They had, foolishly, thought the scrap would bring clarity. Instead, it had cracked the foundations that men had built to keep their names intact. And in that crack, light came through, harsh, uncertain, and dangerous. Rosa leaned into it like someone watching a riot from the cusp of safety, and figured that whether she burned or rebuilt, she would not be silent again. The house smelled of citrus and old smoke when Lucas's confession spread like a stain. Men sharpened their loyalties into weapons. Women who kept secrets behind linen pressed their mouths hard as if trying to stop a leak. For Rosa, the fracture between truth and protection had become a live thing, one that demanded action. The ledger could not simply be an instrument in Matteo's hands. It was a pulse that called for more than bargaining. She had chosen a pact, and now she would hold Matteo to it. He found her at dusk, alone in the small chapel off the servants' wing, where the light came through stained glass in bruised colors. Matteo's silhouette filled the doorway like winter. He carried the wear of a man who had ordered funerals and orchestras with equal calm. He shut the door behind him, and for once there was no audience to soften his edges. "You walked away," he said. His voice had the soft danger of a thing that might fold or fold you. "I needed to see if you would stand for more than your own myth," Rosa answered, the scrape of broomwood under her palm moving like punctuation. "You offered protection, and then you offered possession." Which of us are we to be, owners or people? He stepped closer, the distance governed now by decisions, not by etiquette. I told you we would use the paper to make men answer, he said. I did not tell you I would not dirty my hands. You asked for justice. I can bring you terror dressed as justice. Rosa's laugh was small and bewildered. I asked for my brother's name in a place where people must read it. I did not ask for terror to be dressed in your hand. He reached for her, and she did not pull away. His fingers found the locket, gentle for no reason she could name. We both wear wounds, Rosa. You have loss, I have lies. We can trade blades until nothing remains, or we can try to carve something that keeps us both intact. His thumb brushed the brass like someone touching a promise. She let him touch it. The contact was not surrender. It was negotiation. If you make men confess and then set them loose, what good is that? If you ask men to bleed and then bury the truth, my brother's name will be a rumor again. Mateo's face folded into a private grief. I will not hide it, he said. Not if you stand with me when I name the men who ordered it. His voice had the flatness of a man making a covenant. You will speak. I will open the house to witnesses who cannot be bought. I will do it in a way that preserves what I have built, but forces those who thought themselves untouchable into light. Her heart tilted, tempted by the man who could both save and ruin her. And if you fail, she asked, if you choose your empire, then I will step aside, he said, the words thinner than iron. I will let the world take me, but I will not trade your brother's name for my legend. I swear it. It was not a clean vow. It was a wound offered as a hand. Rosa saw, for a breath, the boy who had learned to keep promises as currency. She thought of Lucas' tremor, of Detective Sergio's ledger of sins, of Lorenzo's sharp teeth. The risk was immense. But silence had already been its own kind of murder. They moved like two conspirators. Mateo summoned a handful of men he trusted, men whose loyalty had cost them more than their reputations. They would not curtain the truth. They would stage its reveal with a precision Mateo knew how to command. He arranged for witnesses, a parish priest who owed no favors, a foreign journalist who had nothing to lose, and a magistrate whose conscience could be bought but not broken. Mateo's reach served the plan. Rosa's courage supplied the spectacle. The night they chose was raw with rain, the air washed like linen. The great hall filled with people who thought themselves immune. Capos in silk, emissaries with secrets in their cuffs, the rival DeLucas waiting to pounce. Rosa stood before them with the locket in her hand, the scrap pressed flat as a truth. Mateo beside her did not stand as a judge, but as someone who had chosen to be visible with her. She spoke her brother's name like a blessing and an accusation. The sound cut the room. There were gasps, a rustle of pockets, a shifting as men considered whether their hands were clean. Luca went pale. His knuckles whitened at his sides. Lorenzo's face was a broken thing between rage and fear. Detective Sergio sat like a man who had walked too close to a fire and smelled his own guilt. When Mateo called the names of those who had signed away a life, the room bristled. The men who had thought themselves untouchable found themselves named into a future where their power was negotiable. Some men denied, others tried to flee. Mateo's men moved like a tide, quietly severing escapes, placing evidence where it could not be ignored. It was theater and truth braided together. The boss who had perfected spectacle used his art to pull daylight into closets. At one point, a shot rang out, an act of vengeance, a desperate attempt to stop the confession. Chaos peeled back like a curtain. Mateo did not flinch. He moved first, throwing himself between the shooter and Rosa. The bullet grazed his shoulder. Blood stitched a hot, bitter line across her shirt. He stumbled but remained upright, a man who had learned to absorb harm as currency. Rosa's knees went weak. She forced herself forward and pressed her hand to his wound, absurdly maternal, reckless. "You didn't have to," she said, voice torn. He shook his head, the pain sharpening his features into something bare. "I promised," he said, "and some promises require us to fall in the open." In the aftermath, when the men who had signed the ledger were taken and confessions bled into morning pages, when the city watched as a myth was loosened, there was no tidy absolution. Men were arrested, others vanished into deals that smelled like compromise. The truth did not free everything. It rearranged the ledger so that debts were counted differently. Rosa stood later in the quiet corridor. Mateo's hand braced at her back, the wound at his shoulder bandaged but real. He had chosen to be wounded for her cause, and in that wounding a different claim was made. Not of ownership, but of sacrificial protection. He had not saved her by making her his. He had risked himself because her cause mattered to him enough to bleed. She placed her palm over his, feeling the pulse like a small victory. "You could have let me go," she said. He smiled through the ache, in a way that made something in her unclench. "And miss this? You make things difficult," he teased. But beneath the bravado was gratitude and a vulnerability he surrendered to no one. They did not become heroes of a clean story. Mateo's empire shifted, as all empires must when cracks are set to light. Some men were punished. Others were parceled into bargains that smelled like partial justice. Rosa did not find peace in every corner. Funerals were still paid with hands that had fingerprints shed rather not trace. But the ledger was out. Her brother's name was spoken where names once vanished. The city, which had counted every mercy as currency, had to reckon with a story that refused to be bought. In the days after, when Mateo walked slower and Rosa cleaned less quickly, they moved around each other with a new grammar. The power between them had changed, not eradicated, but rearranged. He no longer saw her as a thing to be cataloged, and she no longer saw him as a single axis of danger. He had bled for a truth that was not his alone. She had stepped into a world that would no longer let her disappear. One afternoon, as the sun split the harbor into shards of light, Mateo found Rosa on the low terrace. The city sprawled beneath them like a wound and a map. He sat, steady, and slid his hand into hers, careful, without claim. "This won't erase everything," he said. "I know," she answered. Her voice had the calm of someone who had come through arson and lived to tell it. "But it makes a start." He nodded, his fingers tightening in a small, honest pressure. "Then we'll keep starting." She looked at him then, at the man who had invited a joke and found instead a woman who would not be mocked, at the boss who had learned that protection could come with tenderness and sacrifice. There was no grand declaration, no sudden untying of all struggles. There was a bruise at his shoulder, and a ledger in the open, and a future that would be negotiated bitterly. But there was also a hand in hers, winding around grief and duty and offering, bluntly, to keep walking. "Promise me something," she said quietly. He raised his brows. "That when the world wants to buy us with compromise, you'll remember this night. That when mercy tastes like an excuse, you'll choose truth again." Mateo's eyes softened, the lines of calculation easing. "I promise," he said. And it felt less like a man's vow than a treaty between two damaged people choosing each other elsewise. He kissed the bandage at his shoulder as if blessing the wound he'd taken to keep a promise. Outside, the city moved on. Mercenaries rearranged their plans. Newspapers printed names, and funerals were held with names said aloud in a way that felt like justice. Inside, Rosa and Matteo did not find a fairy tale cure. They found a compromise stitched together by pain, courage, and the odd, stubborn tenderness that grew when two people risked their worst for each other's cause. They had rewritten the terms of their power. The boss, who had once summoned a maid as a joke, had learned the cost of a kingdom built on hidden graves. The maid, who had come to be seen, had learned how to stand beside a man whose hands were stained and ask him to choose, a choice that required him to bleed. In the empty chapel, where the light still held dust motes like stars, they sat, not as ruler and subject, but as two people who had traded wounds for a fragile, dangerous claim on one another. They moved through the new normal like people learning to speak a language with verbs for rescue and nouns for restraint. Days folded into one another, a litany of courtrooms and bargaining rooms, of funerals where graves were finally named, and of dinners where Matteo's men measured every smile for honesty. Rosa kept sweeping, though her strokes now had the steadiness of someone who believed in small rituals as anchors. Matteo walked the house with a limp she hated to see, a badge of the bullet that had answered his promise. Between them, the air settled into an economy of gestures. A returned look across a crowded hall, a hand that reached for a jar of sugar and found another hand there first, the quiet removal of a plate when company was too sharp. Neither of them claimed victory, only responsibility. Matteo did what he knew how to do. He rearranged loyalty, paid off silencers, opened ledgers to men who feared being named. He lost friends the way autumn loses leaves, inevitable, excoriating. His empire contracted and reformed, not broken but altered into something that would bear light rather than total darkness. Rosa learned to speak in rooms where men once spoke only in threats. She found, to her surprise, that when she demanded to be listened to, people listened. Not always kindly, not always cleanly, but they did. The tenderness between them was not cinematic, it was the slower thing. Coffee left on the window ledge, a jacket tucked around aching shoulders, a letter sent anonymously to a mother's grave. They argued, fiercely and often, over choices that never felt simple. He accused her sometimes of idealism, she accused him of being resigned to compromise. Both accusations were true. Both were what the other needed to be seen through. One night, months after the scrap was brandished into the light, they walked the terrace together where the city smudged into sea. The harbor lights blinked like a ledger of small mercies. Matteo's scar gleamed pale beneath the collar of his shirt, a map she had touched and not flinched from. He stopped and looked at her as if recalculating a life he had always thought predictable. "You changed my margins," he said, voice low and incredulous. "You taught me that some things are worth breaking the balance over." Rosa let the wind comb her hair, watching the ships cut dark into silver. "You taught me that protection can look like sacrifice," she answered, "that a man who rules can also keep a promise." They stood then, two figures against a city that had weathered revelations and revolts and would weather more. The night was quiet enough to hold a confession. Matteo reached and took her hand with the simple steadiness of a man who had learned to keep his word. He did not speak of changing the world, he did not promise to undo every wrong. Instead, he pressed his palm to hers, an agreement that their work, together, would be to keep telling the truth until it stuck. Rosa rested her head against his shoulder for a moment, not because it erased pain, but because it made the weight of it bearable. Below them, the city breathed, imperfect, luminous, dangerous. And in that imperfect light, a single name was no longer secret. A grave had a marker. A woman who once swept the floors had reclaimed a story. The masquerade's laughter was a memory now. The farce had been replaced by a quieter reckoning. They did not end as lovers in a book-perfect light. They ended instead as two people who had learned how to keep one another when the ledger demanded a price. Matteo kissed the crown of her head like a benediction, and Rosa smiled, small and exact, as if sealing a contract made out of heart and ruin. Beyond the terrace, the harbor swallowed a moonbeam. Rosa tightened her fingers in his. Together, they faced the city, wounded, honest, and oddly resolute, walking forward into a life where names mattered and promises, however stained, could still be honored.